to get rid of as being part of the cement for his own royal authority, his supremacy over the church. It's here in this book that we see him saying on 2 occasions, no bishop, no king, which means that for him there shouldn't be any real reform, certainly not for the sake of reform.
And how does the new translation of the Bible emerge from this complex political landscape? What is it that a Bible will do for him?
Well, quite late on in the second day, one of the Puritans suggests that there might be a new translation of the Bible, because those which were allowed in the reigns of Henry VIII and Edward VI, he says, were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. James leaps on this idea, and that's the genesis of the authorised version, right there in this account of the Hampton Court Conference.
So all that's needed is a king's Bible for a king's church.
Yes, James understands that a new authorised version of the Bible will add to his own supremacy and back up his view of what the Church of England should be.
James wanted England to be a peaceful and balanced society and saw a new translation of the Bible as a key ingredient of that. But there was already a string of English Bibles, so why wouldn't any of them be good enough for the king?
Cambridge University Library is home to some of the oldest editions of the English Bible, Bibles that predate the King James Version, including the grandfather of all English Bibles by the great Protestant martyr William Tyndale. He was a genius. We owe many of the all-time great phrases in English to his translation. Eat, drink and be merry, rise and shine, salt of the earth, bald as a coot.
What it says here is...
But as Lori-Ann Ferrell, a specialist on the translations, explained, James had problems with the seditious tone of many of Tyndale's words.
This is about... Well, we can look here. I think theologically we can see a swipe at the church, a rather large swipe, and very important swipe at the church, in Matthew 16:18, where Jesus is said to have said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That is a very famous line, always used to actually uphold the power of the papacy. Here, Tyndale has translated this, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my congregation.
Which sounds almost absurd. You can't really build a congregation, can you? I mean, that is so propagandist.
What it could be saying simply is, the Pope, he does not make the church, nor do the priests. It's the congregation.
But you can assume that James, reading that, would throw up his hands.
Well, he famously said, no bishop, no king. I think he likes, I mean, all kings like the structure of the institutional church. And then if you read through it...
Any assault on church structure, and as head of that church, on the king's authority, was clearly unacceptable. There was an alternative Bible James could have considered.
Now here we have the 1560s Geneva Bible.
It had been translated by English Protestant refugees in Geneva, one of the centres of the Reformation.
Look how worn out it is. I mean, look at it, it's already...
But the problem was that this Bible contained equally treasonable annotations.
What he probably doesn't like is the characterization, especially in the Old Testament, of kings as tyrants. For example, the story of Herod. One of the notes to this is Matthew 2:20 says, God hath infinite means to preserve them from the rage of tyrants. Not the rage of Herod, the rage of tyrants.
And James would have felt that he was lumped together in that, would he?
There's a king club, I think, or there's a way of thinking about yourself as a king that transcends being lumped with bad kings.
James wasn't the first monarch to balk at this sort of language. 35 years earlier, Elizabeth I ordered a translation designed to buttress the crown.
This is the Elizabethan Bishop's Bible. My God.
It weighs as much as a bishop. It's the size of an Elizabethan bishop.
Tell me about that.
Well, to begin with, it weighs more than I do. And look what we have here. A spectacularly young Elizabeth.
This is state proclamation and the Word of God completely fused. What's wrong with the Bishop's Bible?
Well, it's just bad. Even churches didn't purchase it. There's a lot of bad translating. There's some real clunkers in here. Here's an example. It's Ecclesiastes 11:1. Why don't you read it? This is actually a very famous biblical verse, but it sounds completely incomprehensible in this version.
Lay thy bread upon wet faces, and so shalt thou find it after many days. I think it does try to translate, cast thy bread upon the waters, which is meant to mean give to the poor, because it will return to you in some good form later.
Right, unfortunately, on their face. It seems to me that there's an issue here with the translation of the notion of surfaces, but lay thy bread upon wet faces does not sing. It does, and it's not memorable.
Well, it is for the wrong reason.
The Bishop's Bible had one thing going for it. Its politics were closest to James's. Trouble is, no one was reading it. James realized there was no choice but to order a new translation, one that people would read, that underlined his divine authority, but did not alienate the people who were his subjects. But how to reconcile these conflicting needs? The library also houses a document which reveals how James went about it. It's a stringent set of rules drawn up for the new translation.
The commission for the New Bible was the only concession given to the Puritans at Hampton Court. They lost on every other issue. And what I see in the rules is attempts to control the particular points that were close to the hearts of Puritans. There are several that are relevant to this. The first of the rules is that the ordinary Bible read in churches, commonly called the Bishop's Bible, is to be followed, and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. No marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for the explanation of Hebrew or Greek words. And the old ecclesiastical words to be kept. And the examples that are given are church instead of congregation. Another that is used is baptize instead of wash. So there's a conscious choice there.
And what is that choice, then? What does it represent?
Well, the Greek baptizo simply means to plunge something into water. So wash would be one way of rendering that, whereas baptize has a kind of liturgical association, and the Puritans didn't like that. And the same is true, the word behind church, ecclesia, it simply means a gathering of like-minded people. So they wanted that translated congregation because the word church was so tied up with the existing establishment with bishops and all that they wanted nothing to do with it.
So Bishop's Bible, no Puritan words, no Puritan marginal notes. Do you think the Puritans were sold a dummy here?
In a sense they were, in that they were brought in believing that this was their great chance. And in the end, well, not in the end, in the beginning, the rules effectively strangled their ambitions.
These early decisions about translating individual words would dictate the future beliefs of the Church of England. It would remain ceremonial, sacramental, hierarchical, very different from the Puritan model. So why did the Puritans not simply walk away? Well, don't forget, the new translation was still their idea. And they did leave their mark, as we shall see. But what's fascinating is the idea of a set of rules for what is meant to be, after all, God's own words.
There's no hint in these rules of any divine inspiration, or any thought of God coming down and somehow telling the translators what to do, nor even any suggestion of prayerfulness, of people needing to be in the right frame of mind. These are the exact instructions of royal officials, to be followed to the letter.
All that was left now was to choose who would follow these rules. Surprisingly, James's plan was to appoint not one translator, but an entire army of them, a committee no less, of more than 50 translators.
Pint of Dunbar, please.
Today, the idea that a committee is the best way to produce a masterpiece sounds more like a recipe for disaster. In 1999, I was given the job of writing the history of the Millennium Dome. It was meant to be the great single expression of British national consciousness. It turned out to be a second-rate mixture of funfair, trade show, and propaganda for the already rather tarnished idea of cool Britannia.
It was one of the worst years of my life, full of competing egos and manoeuvring politicians, and every one of them trying to get what they wanted out of the Dome. And that was not entirely unlike James's great project for a new Bible. He too wanted it to be a grand political statement and a centrepiece of national life, and all driven along by some powerful and passionate people.
Of course, the new Bible was to be about God rather than about the world. But how did the King James Bible avoid the same fate? How did it steer clear of the muddle, the mediocrity and speciousness of the Dome? How did the Jacobeans get it so right?
Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. And he said unto them, Cast the net on the right side of the ship, and ye shall find. Now that's a moment from the King James Version, full of the sense of the miraculous, of the disciples meeting Jesus after the crucifixion. Now this is what some 20th century translators made of the same moment. There stood Jesus on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. He said, Shoot the net to starboard, and you will make a catch. For me, about as much atmosphere as a 1930s bathing party.
There's no getting away from the levels of bureaucracy involved in the translation process. Around 50 translators were to be appointed to work in 6 separate subcommittees, or companies as they were called.
If the word company conjures up ideas of shareholders, targets, reporting systems, that's entirely right. In James's time, the model would have been the joint stock trading companies, the Levant or East India Company, set up to share risk and establish broad-based businesses in the new foreign markets. That pooling of many resources in pursuit of a single enterprise was exactly what James had in mind.
But when did a committee ever produce a good idea, let alone a masterpiece?
Okay, I think we're ready to get started this afternoon.
Today, most biblical translations are still done by committee.
There's 3 main Hebrew words to be considered. Eved is the most general, broad term that's typically rendered servant and sometimes slave. Then for women who are in servitude, typically shifcha and amah.
All right, thank you. Now, I think...
More surprising is that it seems many great literary works in Jacobean England were also done in this way.
What we have been discovering in the world of Shakespeare scholarship, for example, is that Shakespeare is not a scholarly genius, but he's often collaborative. People work to deadlines, and teams are the creatures that achieve deadlines. So just as in the theatres, a play was required a month from now, and it's a case of you write Act 1 and I'll do Act 2, so the same kind of collaborative thinking goes quite naturally into the making of the King James Bible. There is an impulse to find a presiding genius who is behind the translation, and there isn't one. The committees did it.
I tend to say the Old Testament gives us a realistic picture.
So who exactly were the translators? And were they in it for the love of